What's up everyone? Welcome back to another video. My name is Nick. On this channel, I'm documenting the process of solo developing my very first indie game in 12 months using the Unity game engine. The game I'm currently developing is a 2D twin-stick shooter inspired heavily by games like Geometry Wars and Resogun. I did an introductory video on what the game is all about, and you can check that out in the link here. In last week's video, I spent some time describing the current state of the architecture in my game and how it's pretty bad. As I was going through the process of learning Unity and learning how to build all the different systems of my game, I was much more concerned with just learning and getting all the pieces to work together than I was worried about proper Unity architecture. But I knew that I could only take that so far and get my game to a prototype stage. I couldn't build a full functioning game off that poorly architected code base. So I spent some time doing some research on proper Unity architecture, and I identified scriptable objects as one potential solution to my architecture problems. I talked a little bit about what they are, but in this week's video, I'm going to go into a lot more detail about what scriptable objects actually are and how I planned on using them to improve the architecture of my game. We'll look at some examples of how my game is currently very poorly architected. I'll talk about the process of how I actually went about refactoring the code base to implement the new architecture. Then we'll look at the old version of my code versus some new version of my code and compare them to see how much of an improvement Scriptable Objects has really been, and I think it's been fantastic. And then we'll talk about what my dev plans are from here for the future. I haven't spent a lot of time implementing new features in the past few weeks, so I'm excited to get back into that. So that's the plan for today's video, so let's just go. Alright, so diving into what actually scriptable objects are. So scriptable objects are similar to monobehaviors, and monobehaviors are the standard component class in Unity that you attach to your game objects. Except that scriptable objects exist as assets in your project, and they can be referenced basically at any time from anywhere. So they're really great for storing data external from your components, and this data can be shared across game objects in your game. This also means that you can edit these values at runtime, such as modifying values to tweak your gameplay experience while your game is actually running, and these changes will be persisted between sessions of your game or your scene running. And this is unlike when you make changes to values on game object components while your scene is running. So if you run your game and you make changes to different game components, then you'll lose those changes when you stop playing your scene. They'll reset back to their original values. So this is one of the cool advantages of scriptable objects. And there are a variety of use cases for scriptable objects, but the main ways I'll be using them in my game are for housing variables, which I'll share across various game objects, and for creating an event system so that my game objects can both trigger and respond to different events that occur during gameplay. So I'm just scratching the surface of how they can be used in my project, and if you're interested in learning more about them, I highly recommend checking out the official Unity documentation on them, as well as checking out the talks on YouTube that I mentioned earlier. So how are scriptable objects actually going to be useful and implemented in my game? So the first thing are variables. So as I mentioned before, scriptable objects allow you to decouple your game objects, and it allows them to read from and write to external data that can be shared across anything in your game. So an example of that, let's say your UI system doesn't need a reference to your player object to read the player's current HP to display on screen. Instead, the player HP can be a scriptable object variable that exists outside of both the player object and the UI system. So when the player takes damage, it updates the player HP scriptable object variable, which the UI system can then read and update what's displayed on the screen. This way you could completely change how your player object works, and the UI system would still always properly display the player's HP because it doesn't care anything about the player object itself whatsoever. All it's interested in is that player HP scriptable object variable that exists as an asset. Alright, so now I want to give you guys an example of how I've poorly architected my game up to this point. So I want to look specifically at the player movement script. And my best intention when I started this was that the script would only care about dealing with player movement. So that's why I named it player movement script. And you can see I started out with some variables for speed and the turn delta of the player. But over time, as I started learning how to implement different types of systems in my game, such as player shooting or the audio system, dealing with particle systems, stuff like that, I started adding more and more things to this script which shouldn't be here. So you can see I have variables that deal with shooting, I have a hard reference to the game manager, references to bullet prefabs, to audio clips, and different game objects, to particle systems. And so you can see that in the script, yes, I actually do deal with player movement and rotating the player, but I'm also doing things like I have methods in here for engaging and disengaging the player propulsion particle system. On top of that, I am doing things like checking player input to see if I should actually instantiate different bullets when the player is attacking, and setting up various references on that bullet object. I'm also doing things like playing firing sound effects and managing firing cooldowns. I also am dealing with things like shaking the camera when the player is destroyed, or playing different audio clips when enemies are hit. So you can see there's a lot of stuff going on in this script that really shouldn't be here. And so I'm hoping that with the refactor, this script is much cleaner and much more easier to follow and modify in the future. So one of my favorite aspects of software development is actually refactoring existing code to improve it, make it more readable, make it more maintainable. So when it came to refactoring the architecture of my game, the first thing I did was to thoroughly review my current code base. And as I refamiliarized myself with all of the code I had written a while ago, I started writing all of these to-do statements and comments in the code each time I identified something that could be refactored with a scriptable object variable or an event trigger. This was pretty time-consuming, but very worth it, as it provided a quick visual indicator in my code where things needed to be changed. I then wrote out in my notebook at a really high level of how I wanted all the different systems to work together. So I knew that I wanted to have a top-level game controller, which was responsible for setting up the play area, spawning the player ship, and all of the additional systems like the audio system, enemy system, UI system, user input. So once I had my actual plan in place, it was time to actually start rewriting the code. So my basic procedure was to change a small part and then play the game and make sure it still worked as intended. So typically I would break something or break many things and then have to fix them after I made small refactors. So this process continues over a few days until I was completely finished and had tested the game enough to feel pretty confident that everything was still working as I intended with the new architecture. So now I'm going to show you what the new player movement script looks like compared to the old player movement script. And remember that in my old player movement script, I was doing lots of things that player movement should never be concerned about, such as managing whether the player is attacking or not, playing different audio events, managing different particle systems, actually manually checking whether there is input from the controller to decide on movement or if the player is attacking. And you can see in the new player movement script, it's so much smaller. It's just a couple methods with a few variables that are only concerned with player movement, as opposed to the old script, which is much larger and has many more references to actual different systems in my game. So now the player movement script is only concerned with whether the player is moving or not. So it should move the player or it should rotate the player. And instead of actually telling a propulsion system to turn on or off, it is raising this propulsion engaged event or propulsion disengaged event based on whether the player is moving or not. And my propulsion system controller is now is a listener for that specific event, and when it gets raised, it knows whether to play or stop the propulsion particle system. So as you can probably guess, I'm really happy with how implementing scriptable objects in my architecture has improved the code base of my game. My script files are much smaller, they're much easier to understand, and it's much easier to understand how all the different components within my game all fit together in this one larger whole. So some things that I'm still thinking about for the future. I still don't have a name for my game yet. If you have any suggestions, leave a comment below. As well, if there's anything you want to see me do different in these videos, or there's a topic you want me to cover about game dev, about doing part-time hobbyist game dev, about working as a professional programmer, please leave your suggestions in the comments and I'll definitely get back to them. So my plan moving forward, I'm going to continue doing these dev vlogs each week, and I really hope you guys enjoy them. That's it for today, and we'll see you in the next one. See ya.